The winter air over central Germany hung heavy with smoke and the faint hiss of melting frost. In a dim factory hall near Kassel, engineers in gray coats stood beside the skeleton of a tank that looked almost American. Its wide tracks, rounded turret, and compact frame whispered the shape of the enemy's pride, the Sherman. Yet the smell of burnt oil betrayed the truth. This was not Detroit steel. This was a desperate imitation, born from shortage and fear. It began months earlier, when reports reached Berlin that the Sherman was overrunning Europe. German generals demanded a response. "If the Americans can build thousands," one shouted, "then we will build one better." Orders moved fast. Blueprints were stolen from wrecked Shermans along the front. What could not be measured was guessed. What could not be manufactured was replaced by whatever the Reich still had left. In the workshop, the chief engineer, Hauptmann Reiser, wiped soot from his glasses. His hand shook slightly. "It will run," he whispered. His assistant nodded, pretending to believe him. The tank's engine was a hybrid of scavenged parts, a bomber's radial cylinder grafted to a truck gearbox. It was a creature stitched from war's leftovers. Each bolt carried the weight of exhaustion. Germany's factories were bombed nightly, metal was scarce, and young mechanics were now boys pulled from schools. Outside, a test crew waited beside the frozen track field. The ground was hard, scattered with the wrecks of earlier tests. A radio crackled from the command tent, its voice strained through static. "Proceed when ready." Reiser climbed onto the hull. For a moment he thought of his brother, killed outside Aachen by a real Sherman. He pressed the ignition. The engine coughed, growled, and filled the air with a choking roar. Men covered their ears. The tank trembled, as if resisting life itself. For 20 seconds, it moved. The treads clawed the ice, the turret swiveled, and, for a breath, pride returned to the faces around it. Then a sharp metallic knock echoed deep inside. The smell of gasoline turned sharp, almost sweet. Flames licked from the rear grills, small at first, then violent. A mechanic screamed for an extinguisher, but the pump had frozen overnight. The crew jumped clear as the fire grew into a furnace. Reiser stood still, watching his creation burn. The heat bit his face, yet he did not step back. The sound of the engine faded into the crackle of collapsing metal. In that glow, the dream of copying the Sherman melted to slag. Behind him, the radio repeated the same message through the static. "Report status. Report status." No one answered. The only voice left was the wind moving through the empty test field, whispering over the ashes of imitation. By dawn, the wreck of the test tank still smoked. The frost around it had melted into black puddles, reflecting the dull red of the rising sun. Soldiers walked in silence, their boots sinking in the mud. The burned-out hull looked almost alive, its metal skin twisted and breathing steam. Hauptmann Reiser stood apart, a clipboard in hand, pretending to write, while his eyes stayed locked on the ruin. He knew the report he would send to Berlin would be rewritten before it was read. Failures had no safe place in this war. Behind him, the factory siren moaned once and fell quiet again. Air raids had stopped for the moment, leaving only a strange emptiness. The engineers gathered near a shattered truck, whispering in low voices. They argued whether the fuel lines had leaked or the cooling system had cracked. One young mechanic, his face still black from soot, muttered that the American design could not simply be copied. "They use alloys we do not even have names for," he said. Reiser heard him but did not respond. He thought of the reports he had studied, the Sherman's engine reliability, its smooth transmission, its fast repairs in the field. Germany could not match that anymore. He returned inside the workshop, stepping over hoses and toolboxes. A radio on the table played a tired march interrupted by bursts of static. Beside it lay a photograph of a real Sherman, captured in France, its smooth armor glistening under sunlight. The image looked almost peaceful compared to the broken machine outside. Reiser traced the outline of its turret with his finger. He whispered a line to himself. "They built it for soldiers, not for engineers." The words stayed in the cold air. The door opened, and Oberst Becker entered, his greatcoat heavy with frost. "The High Command expects another trial within 2 weeks," he said without greeting. Reiser kept his voice steady. "We need months." Becker shook his head. "We have days." His boots echoed as he walked toward the window. The rising smoke outside blurred his reflection. "Do you understand what failure means now?" he asked quietly. Reiser did not answer. He did not need to. Everyone understood. When Becker left, Reiser sank onto a stool. The factory lights flickered from power cuts. He looked at his sketches, each one a compromise, each line a reminder of scarcity. The American factories built thousands, while his team built ghosts. The war had shifted from courage to production, from heroes to machines, and Germany was running out of both. He closed the folder and listened. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed again. Another raid. The men rushed for cover, but Reiser stayed a moment longer, watching the ceiling tremble. Dust fell like snow, settling on his hands. For the first time, he felt the weight of the war, not as a battle, but as a slow collapse of effort, metal, and hope. When the lights finally went out, the workshop sank into silence. Only the ticking of a cooling engine echoed through the dark, like the last heartbeat of a dream that never learned to move. The following week, the snow turned to rain. The road leading to the test ground dissolved into mud and oil. Reiser arrived before dawn, his coat soaked, his face hollow from nights without sleep. The burned tank had been hauled aside, its frame still visible like a skeleton beside the field. The crew had started work on a second prototype, built in haste from what could be salvaged. The factory smelled of wet steel, burnt rubber, and cold coffee. Reiser climbed onto the new hull. This version was heavier, its engine better shielded, its fuel lines double-layered. But as he ran his hand over the armor, he felt the thinness beneath the paint. German steel was no longer what it had been in 1940, recycled metal, weaker alloys, all welded by hands that trembled with hunger. The war was devouring quality. Every screw whispered compromise. At the far end of the hall, a group of boys in overalls worked silently. One of them could not have been more than 16. He was welding the turret ring, sparks lighting his tired eyes. When Reiser passed, the boy saluted awkwardly. "Will it work this time, Herr Hauptmann?" he asked. Reiser forced a nod. "It must." The boy smiled faintly, unaware that hope had become the last resource Germany had left. By noon, the prototype stood ready. The rain had stopped, leaving a gray mist over the proving ground. Soldiers gathered again, fewer this time. No one wanted to witness another failure. The radio in the command tent crackled. "Begin test." Reiser climbed inside. The controls were stiff, the gauges flickering. He turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then roared to life, smoother than before. The tank rolled forward, slow but steady. A wave of relief spread through the small crowd. He shifted gears. The machine responded, treads biting into the mud. For a moment, it looked like victory, an imitation that finally breathed. But at the far end of the track, the turret jammed. The gun refused to elevate. Then the engine temperature spiked. A thin line of smoke curled from the rear plate. Reiser ordered the driver to stop. Too late. A deep metallic bang echoed. Flames burst again from the exhaust vents. Men shouted. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. Reiser hit the hatch release and climbed out. The young mechanic from earlier ran forward with an extinguisher, his boots sliding in the mud. He reached the rear, pulled the pin, and sprayed. The foam hissed, steam rising, but the fire refused to die. The heat forced everyone back. Within minutes, the second tank was gone. Reiser stood silent, rain mixing with sweat on his face. No one spoke. The radio repeated its command through the static, asking for status. This time he answered. His voice was calm. "Failure. Complete failure." He turned away and watched the smoke drift into the mist. Somewhere far beyond the clouds, he imagined the real Shermans rolling across Europe, steady, reliable, unstoppable. His machine had not even survived its own birth. The next morning, the rain had frozen over the field, turning the mud into a brittle crust. The two burned prototypes stood like monuments to failure, blackened, twisted, and silent. The snow settled over them quietly, as if the earth itself wanted to bury the evidence. Hauptmann Reiser watched from the doorway of the workshop, holding a cup of bitter coffee gone cold. His eyes were dull, his uniform stained with grease. The war had drained color from everything, even from hope. Inside, the mechanics worked slower now. Their hands moved out of duty, not belief. The young boy who had fought the fire sat near the stove, his eyebrows singed, his face pale. He looked up when Reiser entered, but said nothing. Reiser placed a hand on his shoulder and left it there for a moment. Words were useless now. The boy had learned too early what silence meant in a dying army. Oberst Becker returned that afternoon. His car arrived under guard, tires slicing through the slush. He stepped out, his face unreadable. "The High Command has canceled the project," he said simply. "Berlin says resources are to be redirected to anti-aircraft weapons." He paused, glancing toward the wrecks outside. "They said we have no time to imitate. Only to survive," Reiser did not argue. The decision was not cruel, only inevitable. Becker handed him a sealed envelope. "You are reassigned to an ammunition depot near Bremen, effective immediately." His tone was cold but not unkind. There was a trace of pity beneath the discipline. "You did what was possible, Hauptmann. No man can build with ashes." When Becker left, the silence felt heavier than before. Reiser sat at his desk and opened the envelope. Inside was a travel pass, ration stamps, and a brief note signed by a general he had never met. The ink bled slightly where rain had touched it. He folded the paper and looked around the workshop one last time. Each machine, each tool, carried a memory of effort that no longer mattered. Outside, the smoke from the burned tanks drifted low across the field, blending with the fog. Reiser walked to the wreck of the first prototype. The metal was still warm beneath the frost. He rested his hand on it. Beneath the ash, he could still trace the curves copied from the American design. It had been a perfect outline without a heartbeat. He thought of the thousands of real Shermans rolling through the Ardennes, their engines humming, crews laughing through open hatches, machines built by a nation that still had fuel, factories, and faith. Germany had run out of all three. A gust of wind scattered the ashes into the air. They swirled around him like dark snow, then vanished into the gray horizon. Reiser turned away and began to walk back toward the barracks. The footsteps behind him were faint. No one followed. The project had died quietly, not with an explosion, but with a sigh. As he reached the gate, the factory siren wailed again, not for work, but for another air raid. He looked up. The sky rumbled. Somewhere above the clouds, bombers moved like ghosts, engines humming the same steady rhythm that had defeated his creation. The train to Bremen crept through a landscape that no longer looked like a country. Factories were broken shells. Villages lay silent, windows shattered, roofs torn open like wounds. Reiser sat by the window, coat buttoned to the neck, his eyes following the distant flicker of fires still burning on the horizon. Every station he passed seemed emptier than the last. At one stop, a group of evacuees huddled near a water pump, their faces pale and hollow. A child waved at the passing train, though no one waved back. When the train halted near Hanover, the conductor announced a delay. Allied bombers had struck the line ahead. Reiser stepped down to stretch his legs. The air smelled of wet ashes and smoke. He saw a column of prisoners repairing the tracks under guard, moving slowly, heads bent. The sound of hammers on rail was steady, rhythmic, almost mechanical. War had turned everything human into machinery. By evening, he reached the depot. The buildings were half buried in snow, surrounded by stacks of ammunition crates. Inside, soldiers worked under dim lanterns, counting shells and marking ledgers. Reiser reported to the commanding officer, a thin man with tired eyes. The officer signed his papers without looking up. "You will oversee inventory," he said. "Keep the records dry. Nothing else matters now." Days turned to weeks. The war moved north and west, dragging defeat behind it like a shadow. Reiser kept to his work, writing numbers that no longer meant anything. Every night the sky trembled with distant thunder from the front. Sometimes the lights flickered and the men would pause, waiting for the all-clear siren. They always resumed with the same slow rhythm, as if habit alone could hold the world together. One evening, while inspecting a warehouse, Reiser found a crate labeled in English. The stenciled letters read, U.S. Army Vehicle Parts. Someone had captured it months earlier and sent it here by mistake. He pried it open and found inside a single rust-streaked component from a Sherman's gearbox. The metal was still smooth, perfectly machined. He turned it in his hands, feeling the precision that his own tools could never reproduce. For a moment, he imagined the sound of that engine starting, clean and confident, unbroken by fear. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow. The floodlights flickered, their glow lost in the whiteness. Reiser placed the Sherman part back into the crate and closed the lid. He wrote a note across it in pencil. "Send home. It runs better than ours ever did." The irony made him smile for the first time in months. Later that night, as bombers passed overhead, he stood by the open door of the depot and watched their searchlights sweep across the clouds. The sound reminded him of the test field, of engines that coughed and burned. Yet this time he felt no anger, no shame, only a quiet understanding. The war had not been lost by soldiers or engineers. It had been lost by exhaustion. The sky thundered once more and snow mixed with ash. Reiser turned away from the noise, his silhouette fading into the dim light. Behind him, the last echo of his failed machine seemed to dissolve into the wind, leaving only the hum of engines that still knew how to move.